Hi everyone, welcome to the video in which we will discuss the sound chapter from Mary Oliver. It is the fourth video of this week and is going to do something a little bit different than the last two videos did. The diction, tone, and voice, and then the imagery chapter mainly focused on definition and Mary Oliver defining the two different techniques, diction, tone, and then imagery in the respective chapters. And we were looking at that just to encourage you and give you ideas about how to develop your definition, which is the first part of the solution section of your essay. Just making sure that your reader knows what you're talking about in as much detail and definition as possible. Now, we're going to look at the sound chapter today, and we're going to see some of that definition, of course, as well, but we're also going to talk about examples that Mary Oliver chooses in order to develop that argument and, in a way, develop the definitions she sets at the outset. And then we're going to look at how she introduces and analyzes a poem as one of her primary examples to prove her point about how sound makes meaning and has a purpose in poetry. Now, you might be thinking, if you remember the imagery chapter, that there are examples throughout the imagery chapter. There's a lot of them. There's examples of personification and examples of metaphor. There's also the two full poems that are quoted, the Stanley Kunitz poem and the Elizabeth Bishop poem. So there's examples throughout those essays, and yet the difference is in those essays, Mary Oliver does not analyze those examples. She does not explain the examples and how they are representative of the skills that she's talking about. Now, in the sound chapter, we're going to see her choose examples and then explain how this is a really good example to show the technical skill in action. So, one other distinction I want to make before we go to Mary Oliver is that the sound chapter is persuasive. Unlike the last two, which I said were more informational, there wasn't much of an argument that she was making. There's no real rhetorical situation or problem that she addressed that she's trying to persuade an audience to see in a new way or see in a different way. The sound chapter, on the other hand, has a little bit more of an element of that to it. There isn't a clearly developed problem-making section, but there is a problem she refers to. And then there also then is a clear persuasive element to her writing. And we're going to see that by the way that she explains and expands on the examples. Because the moment you have an audience, you cannot just give them examples and hope that they understand how the examples prove the point. You have to explain it for them. You have to show them how that example proves the point you're trying to make. And so we're going to see her do that in sound, and we're also going to look back to Charles Baxter to see how he does that. So let me pull up a document I put together just to keep us focused, because we are doing a number of things in this video, and so I've kind of charted out what I'd like to talk about. We're going to work through it one bit at a time, and we're going to pull up Mary Oliver's sound chapter to look at some places along the way. And then we'll be done after that. We're mainly looking at what is listed here. Finding audience-specific examples to illustrate your technical skill. That's why we're looking at sound. It's one of the models, one of the things it's modeling for us. And it's also modeling how to choose a poem that best represents your technical skill in action. So examples and analysis, and including a poem as an example to be analyzed. So, first thing I said here is that Mary Oliver's sound chapter is a great model text for you as you write the How Does a Poet Make Meaning essay. By model text, I mean that it is trying to accomplish the similar goals that you're trying to accomplish, and it's answering a very similar question, and it's doing it in a way that's really convincing. And for our sake, that uses a lot of the skills that we've practiced throughout the quarter up to this point to develop a convincing argument. So it's going to be a good model text. That by model I don't mean copy or exact imitation. But she does a number of things in this essay that you are going to want to look at and ask yourself if it works for your essay, if it works for your audience in your rhetorical situation, to develop something much like the way she does. So before we get into the specifics and her structure and how she chooses examples, just wanted to point out a few things. Wanted to point out that there's no problem making, or there's no fully developed problem making in this essay, because again, this is a chapter in a book. The book has an introduction which establishes the rhetorical situation in a deeper way, establishes the audience and the purpose of the book as a whole. So we don't have, chapter specific problems that she's fully developing. But she does hint at the problem. There's a hinted problem in the very first line of the essay, and then also 2 pages later. And it's this idea of sounds being random or sounds not being random. And so we see it here at the beginning of the essay. She says, to make a poem, we must make sounds. Not random sounds, but chosen sounds. So she's making this distinction between 2 different ways to think about how words make sounds. Now, some people might think that the sounds that words make are completely random. They're not chosen by anyone. They're not chosen by the poet. They're not chosen by the writer. There happens to be an interesting sound. It's just happened randomly. The opposite point of view is that sounds are chosen, carefully chosen by the writer, in this case the poet, to have a specific beauty to them, but also a specific tone and a specific meaning or emotional effect. So she sets that problem out from the very beginning, or those 2 perspectives. And one way to think about the problem making that I've explained before, the problem making, you're just identifying and developing and proving what your audience's perspective of your topic is, and then you're going to change that perspective to teach them something new. And so we can understand that the sound chapter, she's writing to a perspective that sound in words strung together are random, but she's responding by saying, no, they're actually chosen, and they're chosen for a reason. If we look at the bottom of 22, I think she says this again. She says, here we begin to understand that our working material, the alphabet, represents families of sounds rather than random sounds. Again, hinting at this distinction. We might think they're random, but actually they're not, and she's out to prove that they're not, and that a writer chooses them in order to have specific effects. So that answers that question about, well, why isn't there any problem making? Well, there actually is. It's just not developed in the way that we saw it necessarily in Barbara Holland's essays. But for you, you are needing to fully develop a rhetorical situation, an audience, and a problem. So this is one instance where you won't be imitating Mary Oliver's sound chapter, because you do need to fully develop your problem-making section. A couple more foundational ideas of this essay. She keeps a focused response to the course question. It's almost as if she's answering this question that I developed for this prompt. Hey, Mary Oliver, how does a poet make meaning? Sound. And that's her answer, in the same way that you're picking one of the 5 technical skills of poetry and saying, this is how a poet makes meaning. Now, she does state at the end of the essay, I think even the last sentence, that no single device, no single technical skill of poetry makes its meaning, but that it is useful to analyze how one technical skill makes that meaning. And we could just go there real fast to see it. Let's see. She ends the last sentence, but more than one technical device assisted, the first of which is an extraordinary use of sound. And so this is an interesting distinction I need to make to you. I think I've said it before, but I want to say it again. When we read a poem and try to understand its meaning, when we first approach the poem, like you did with the poetry packet or any poems you've read this quarter, You're using all your knowledge about how poets write and how they make meaning. You're using your understanding of all the technical skills to figure out what the message or what the value of this poem is, and also how the poet has gotten you to respond emotionally or logically. So, of course, we could read Lake Isle of Innisfree, and we can talk about the imagery, we can talk about the diction choices, we can talk about the sound, and we can talk about the form as well, because that one's in rhyme pattern. And all four of those things would help us support the meaning of the poem or analyze what the meaning of the poem is. Now, though that is true for pretty much all poems, more than one technical device is there. What you're going to look to do is choose a poem that best represents or highlights one of the technical skills being used to develop meaning, with an understanding that there are other technical skills there assisting, but your focus isn't going to be on them. You might, on your own, in your own head, in your own analysis of the poem, when you're preparing to write, come to an understanding of the poem through all the devices, but then you're only writing through the lens of one of them. And that's an interesting thing to note here, that you might feel tempted to be like, well, diction makes meaning too. Of course it does. Of course it does. But you're just looking through the lens of, say, imagery, if that's what you've chosen, or sound, if that's what you've chosen. And we're going to see Mary Oliver keep her focus on sound, even though she could have easily talked about imagery and tone, and in this case as well, form, because there's a rhyme pattern here in this poem. Let's go back to the beginning. And I think that covers our basics. Now, the next two things I want to talk about are first, the structure of her essay, where her definition section is, how she chooses examples, and then we're going to move on to the inclusion of the poem as one of her examples and talk about how she even structures her analysis of the poem. And then we'll move on to Baxter from there. So, we're going to look at how she starts the essay with definition. And then once she's fully defined what sound is and how it works, then she's going to move on to examples. And we're going to pay particular attention to how those examples engage the reader's level of understanding about her topic, about poetry, and specifically about sound in poetry and how sound makes meaning. Now, we can say from the very beginning that this is a foreign idea to many of us, but it's also a foreign idea for young writers who might be reading this poetry handbook by Mary Oliver. How does the sound of something make meaning? It's the diction, it's the definition of the word, it's the image, those things make meaning. How does the sound make meaning? They're less familiar with it. It's to a certain degree, it's more abstract. And so she understands this about her reader, and she needs to choose examples that engage her reader's level of understanding. Because when you're trying to explain something that's abstract and difficult and unfamiliar to your audience, maybe your audience resists it, you need to get them interested. And one way to get them interested is to make sure that they are never confused, they're never objecting with questions, but they're simply nodding at what you said and saying, yes, that makes sense. Now you can move on to the next. So we're going to look at how she chooses what we'll call small examples first, kind of easy to digest, simpler examples, and then builds up to larger, more complex examples. Not too different from what Barbara Holland did in Cigarettes, when she started with some very simple, easy to understand claims about cigarettes. Well, they tasted good. They were sexy. Everyone gets those. And then she moves on to larger ideas about social behavior that get a little bit more complex. So we're going to take a look at that first. So let me start by going back to the essay here. So she pretty much begins the essay with a question. How much does it matter what kinds of sounds we make? How do we choose what sounds to make? So why does it matter? Again, we talk about meaning. She's saying we choose sounds to have a particular meaning or to be significant in some way. How do we choose that? And she wants to set out and answer that question to us, and she wants to explain it to us. She first gives us some overview ideas. These technically are examples from the very beginning, but they're kind of just to set the stage, to get us interested in the difference between slow down and hurry up, to get us interested in the difference between go and stop. And then she quotes, of course, William Carlos Williams, and this is almost a way to just transition into sound. And then she asks another question, but why is a rock not a stone? And ends it there, ends that section there. And she picks up in 20 with what I'm going to call the beginning of her definition section. So she's saying that sound matters and that sound is not random, but it's chosen. And she first needs to define then how sounds are chosen and how sounds have similarities and how sounds are grouped together. They're not just randomly thrown out there. And so in order to do that, to define what she means, as if an audience asked her, what do you mean by sounds being grouped together and having seemingly a chosen pattern or characteristics? And she says, well, let me define that for you a little more. I'm going to explain what our alphabet is broken down as into categories. And she calls these the raw materials. And then the next 2 pages, 21 and 22, she explains the difference between, of course, vowels and consonants. But within that, she explains the difference between semivowels and mutes, and goes on, I think, to talk about aspirates. And she talks about she talks about liquids here. Mutes is another that shows up at the end. And she's talking about categories of sound. Because if she's trying to prove that they're not random, she needs to group them to have some sort of consistency. So I'm going to call this definition. She's simply defining what sound is in poetry, first and foremost. Now, even as I said that, as I transition into talking about examples, as I said that, what sounds are like in poetry, I have to stop myself. Because she actually hasn't talked about poetry in this section of definition. She's simply talking about sound. And she's talking about words. Our alphabet, whether we're putting it in poetic form or not, has these characteristics, can be divided into these categories, has these different similarities that are not random, but that have some form to them. So that's an interesting thing to point out as we move into looking at her examples, that she shifts out of her definition and then moves into the examples, is that she begins her examples by not talking about poetry at all. She's already introduced us to the rock and the stone idea earlier, and she'll get back to it. But here she starts her first example of what she means by sounds not being random, but being chosen, and also having a felt quality, meaning having an emotional or tonal response. And she goes on to give us an example of something that we understand in our daily lives. And she gives us the example of saying, hush, please be quiet, or shut up. Now, I'm not going to fully look and explain the analysis she does for these 3 phrases to show how the sound makes meaning, the sound is not random, and also the sound has a felt quality. But I do want to point out that significant aspect, that she's writing to an audience who is unfamiliar with, uncertain about, confused about how sound makes meaning in poetry and in general. And she decides that it would be too much to start with an example of poetry and the sound working in it, because her audience would be too lost. They would be too confused. So she needs to start with something more familiar, more digestible. Just like we talk about with metaphor, the thing that you use in metaphor is your concrete comparison. It needs to be familiar to the audience and understandable to them and move them emotionally. So here she gives us her first example to talk about how sound has a felt quality, and she uses these 3 phrases. Now, I do want to just point out that she does analyze them. That's the difference between this chapter and the imagery chapter. She goes on to tell us why they're different and to tell us what the felt quality of each of these is. And she does it one after another. And she moves on, though, after this first example. I'll call this example 1 to example 2. She goes back to what is the difference between a rock and a stone? And immediately she answers that question by saying what the difference is and what the different felt quality of these two is. So that's example number 2. Again, it's not poetry she's talking about. She's just talking about two words, rock and stone, words that we use every day. And so she's using these two examples, examples 1 and 2, as what we'll call these kind of smaller examples, these easier to digest examples. And she's doing this before she builds up to Robert Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening, which becomes her third example, and what we'll call her big example if we're talking about moving from small to big. Now she decides that her audience understands enough how sound makes a felt quality or an emotional response in a listener or in a speaker, really. And she says, okay, now let's apply this to a poem. I think this is important to note for all of you as you go in to write your final essay, that you're writing to an audience who's unfamiliar with poetry, actually don't like it. They have a perspective that is not favorable. That's why you've developed a whole problem-making section about it. If you start trying to convince them and explain to them how imagery makes meaning, and you just jump right into a poem, they might say, I'm confused. I don't get how this works. I don't like this. They might object with the very things that you identified in the problem making because they haven't given them the foundation to build off of yet. Mary Oliver gives her audience a foundation and builds up to Robert Frost's stopping by woods on a snowy evening. So that covers this idea of the structure of her essay. She starts with the definition. She moves to an example 1 and 2, which are kind of these smaller, more familiar examples, to this larger example, which is a poem. What she's keeping in mind as she chooses these examples is engaging her reader's level of understanding. And ultimately, the important part is that she keeps her focus on the skill at hand. The skill here is sound and how it creates meaning. And then she ultimately shows how poets make meaning of this sound as well. So we're going to move on to a quick look at how she structures the analysis of the poem. It's example number 3, just so you have some foundation to build off of yourself. And then we'll move to Charles Baxter. So we're going to look at the structure of her analysis, how she contextualizes the poem, and then how she manages and develops the analysis throughout the poem, one bit at a time. So I want to point out that I love what she does in this first paragraph. Something that you might want to consider doing for your audience as well. That she doesn't just introduce Robert Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening and say she's going to analyze it, and then start analyzing how sound makes meaning. She gives us some contextualization to understand. She summarizes the poem in a certain degree for us. She actually, in an interesting way, commands us to read the poem and says, keep in mind exactly what's going on. The pause within a journey, the quiet, introspective voice of the speaker, the dark and solitary woods, the falling snow. She kind of has already done some of the reading of the poem for us. Well, here's the basic story. Here's the characters. Here's the tone. That gets the reader familiar with the poem that's about to be analyzed instead of just jumping right into an analysis. So after this contextualization, this summary of the poem, this story of the poem to get the reader more familiar, then she moves into her analysis. And I want to just point out visually first how she structures this. She has this poem that is 4 stanzas, 4 lines each, and her analysis takes stanza by stanza, the initial 4 lines. One can say any number of things about the little horse of the second stanza. In stanza 3. And then in line 2 of the last stanza. Oh no, she brings up stanza 4 here. It leads us to ready ourselves for the resolution in stanza 4. So I wanted to point out that as she's analyzing this poem and analyzing the sound in it, she's finding a way to kind of segment her analysis in her reader's mind so they don't get overwhelmed with information. It's not just one long paragraph of analysis of this poem and how sound works in it. Instead, she says, well, let me organize this in a way that makes sense. First, I'm going to talk about the first stanza, and I'm going to do it and focus on it and its singularity as a focused idea. And then I'm going to transition and move into the next one. And sometimes per stanza uses multiple paragraphs to talk just about the one. I think that'll be good for you to think about how you structure your analysis and divide it into paragraphs that focus on maybe one idea at a time or one place of your poem at a time. Even if you don't have a poem that is broken into stanzas, I think you can look at your poem, say Coming Close if you're analyzing that poem, and break it into sections. Oh, this kind of first section that is the part where Levine is describing the woman, that ends at a certain point and then moves on to the imperatives. So you can kind of divide it for them and walk them through that division that you've made. And I wanted you to see how Oliver does that, and you can think about imitating that in yours. Now that we've seen this structure, we can just look paragraph by paragraph and see the analysis that we're talking about here. Because we're talking about sound and how it makes a felt quality. That's the analysis. It's looking at the effect of the skill on the audience. And she does that here in the very first one. So let's read this first paragraph. We're not going to read all of them. And look at where she's talking about the effect, the emotional or tonal effect on the audience. And then we'll make an argument about how she builds her analysis to come up with the meaning of the poem. She says the initial 4 lines are rife with W's and TH's, F is there and V, 3 sets of double L's. The heaviness of the vowels is increased by the use of diphthong. The 2 words that end with a mute, think and up, are set within the line and thus are softened. All other mutes are softened within the words themselves. One could scarcely read these lines in any other than a quiet, musing, almost whispered way. So you see at the very end there, and even a little bit before that, she's talking about the softened quality of the sounds, particularly identifying that there's not that many mutes, but there are a number of liquids throughout the poem, and it makes the tone of this first stanza very soft. She says softened twice. She says quiet, musing, whispered, that the quality, the emotional quality of this first stanza, the reader picks up, is one of gentleness, one of quiet isolation, not in a bad sense, but just kind of peace in a way. And we know in this opening stanza that he's watching the woods fill up with snow. So there's this snowy scene, very whispered. When she's talking about the effect of the sound, that's when she's doing analysis. Now she goes on to do that with stanza 2. She goes on to do that with stanza 3. She's saying they're not soft anymore. They're insisting to be heard. The sounds are rising up. They have a different felt quality to them. And she does that through all the stanzas, one at a time. Now, let's see. I want to pause on the analysis part for a second to go to where Mary Oliver makes a claim about what the purpose of the poem is, and then go back to talk about how her analysis of the sound in these stanzas has contributed to that. So you can look at the analysis of stanza 2, 3, and 4 and see where she's talking about the effect on your own. But we're going to jump ahead to the full meaning of the poem that Oliver is stating. And she says it on the last page. Let me find it. She says here at the very end, right before the last sentence, the poem is an extraordinary statement of human ambivalence and resolution. We've talked about how poems are statements. They are arguments. They do have messages, but they're just not directly delivered. They're delivered through story, and they're developed through imagery and diction choices to involve the reader in understanding this experience. And though this is not a fully explained and developed meaning of the poem. She doesn't really talk about what the ambivalence is and what the resolution is and why it's important that the resolution comes after the ambivalence and what that means for the audience and their lives. But she does at least say that it's an extraordinary statement of this idea. Ambivalence is an uncertainty to a certain degree, and it's kind of a balance between two places, and then resolution is making a determined decision to do something. And if we just go back to the analysis of the felt quality of each stanza, we're going to see that Robert Frost brought us through that experience. He made us feel the ambivalence before we felt the resolution. And so why this is important is because when you're doing your analysis of the poem as a whole, to say what the poem means, to then work backwards from there and show how your technical skill develops that meaning, you have to look at the interplay or the development of the emotional responses that are felt throughout the poem. You can't just kind of look at one place and say, oh, because I felt this way here, then the message of the poem must be this. You have to look at the different places of the poem and how they maybe develop or change or play against each other in their emotional responses. One idea of this is in Yeats's Lake Isle of Innisfree. And he's talking about peace in that poem. And a lot of you, when you analyze that in your video response, said that, oh, it's obvious that William Butler Yeats wants his audience to feel a sense of peace, of living in the countryside. But that's really not the full meaning of the poem. That's pretty surface level meaning of the poem. A deeper meaning of the poem is that he's telling his reader that they have to grasp peace, they have to fight for peace, they have to demand it, they have to stand up for it. There's quite a bit of tension in that poem as well, that it's not just something that comes easy in our dreams, but that we have to fight for it. And so that gets into a deeper idea that we can only understand if we look at the first line of each stanza. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. It's kind of a command. And if we're not looking at how that command has one effect and then the description has another, and then talk about how they work together, we're not getting a full reading of the poem. Now, the same thing is happening here in Stopping by Woods. We can't just read the first stanza and say, oh, this poem is about stopping to enjoy the beauty of nature in isolation and feel how wonderful it is. Because that's not the entirety of the poem. That's the effect of the first stanza. But if we read the full poem, we'll realize that in life we'll come across moments like this. We can just find beauty and peace in and rest in, maybe want to even escape our lives in this moment of isolation and relaxation. But ultimately, there's a larger message about resolution, that we can't stay in that place, that we have to make decisions, and that we have to act, otherwise we'll get stuck. And that's the bigger message that we're getting to in Robert Frost's poem. Human ambivalence and resolution, a statement about it. And it's only by Mary Oliver looking stanza by stanza and seeing the different effects that she can come up with that idea. So, what have we seen so far in the analysis of the poem? We see that she structures it by giving a summary or contextualizing the poem. We see that she structures her analysis stanza by stanza. We see that every stanza focuses on how her technical skill creates a felt quality or an emotional effect on the audience. And we see how that builds up and the interplay of those different effects say what the purpose or message of the poem is. So, she's a great model for you not only to think about your argument as a whole, but specifically your analysis of the poem you choose as one of your examples. And I want you also to look back at Charles Baxter. I'm actually not going to do it. This video, I think we've gone on long enough with this idea so far. Charles Baxter just supports everything I've just said about Mary Oliver. Is that if you look back at him, you're going to notice that once he starts his solution, after the problem-making section we've already discussed, he starts defining inflection over and over by saying inflection is, inflection is, inflection is, inflection does, inflection does. After the definition section, then he gets into examples of reflection. And he starts small at first. He's giving examples of stage acting, of actors who actually do verbally inflect. And there may be one small paragraph at a time. Oh, look at this example from Hamlet. Look at this example from this play. But then ultimately he builds up to these two fictional stories, these two short stories. And for each of those, he analyzes them for 2 pages. Not one paragraph, but multiple pages. And it has this similar building effect. Start with definition, move to simple or smaller or more straightforward examples, build to larger ones, and always focus on the effect of the skill being discussed on the audience, specifically the emotional effect and the mental effect that it has. And then identify how that builds to make an argument for the poem itself. So, Charles Baxter, also an amazing model text for you for the final essay. Both him and Oliver in the sound chapter are doing great things that you want to imitate in your draft of the How Does a Poem Make Meaning essay. That'll be it for this video. I'm going to return with a short video about Charles Baxter, specifically talking about how he quotes, and you're going to follow up that video with a discussion response to show that you have practiced what needs to be done for the draft as well, which is including quotes. Okay.